This is a presentation on stakeholder management. Good management is the art of making problems so interesting and their solutions so constructive that everyone wants to get to work and deal with them. This is a nice quote from Paul Hawken, and it's very important for stakeholder management because the idea is that we need to build the interest of key stakeholders that will help us support the project. Stakeholder definition. Project stakeholders are the groups or individuals whose interests are impacted positively or negatively by the project or whose interests can impact the project. Let's have an understanding who are our stakeholders. Project stakeholders include beneficiaries or group or project interventions, partner organizations, both government and non-government, donor organizations or individuals that contribute funds, goods or services, project staff and volunteers, regulatory bodies, either national or international, specifically if the project deals with areas such as health, local authorities, can be national, local government, the media and the general public, social, political, and religious groups. The list of the stakeholders can be significant, can be large for projects depending on the nature and the scope of the project. But more or less they have this range of individuals and groups that are part of that list of stakeholders. Here's our process to stakeholder management, where we look at their inputs in terms of information from the proposal, the log frame, and previous information on projects about stakeholders. We plan by stakeholder mapping. We build relationships. We check, we make an evaluation of the relationship with the stakeholders, and we adapt and make improvements to the strategy. Key outputs of that process is a stakeholder management plan, stakeholder analysis matrix, stakeholder evaluations, and improvement plans. Our first step, planning, is stakeholder analysis. It's the process to identify, analyze, and map the stakeholders and develop stakeholder management strategies. The next step, is build the relationships, implementing the strategies through communications and obtaining support to the project. Next step, check, is stakeholder evaluation. We evaluate the results of the stakeholder strategies. And the last step, adapt, is improving our stakeholder management strategies. The step of stakeholder identification is by which the team and some members of the organization help the project identify the internal and external stakeholders, and we organize them by the levels of influence and interest on the project. To do that, we use the stakeholder matrix, which ranks the level of influence and the level of interest in the project from low to high, and then we group our different stakeholders into each one of these areas. The idea of the stakeholder matrix that helps us identify the key strategies to manage the different groups of stakeholders. One of those strategies is to build stakeholder relationships, and that means the process in which we involve them, we consult them, we inform them. The idea is to build enough interest from key stakeholders so they can support the project. There may be some stakeholders that are not too supportive because they don't have enough information about the project or they have the wrong information about the project. So it's important in that process of building the relationships that the project manager and team members are involving the stakeholders in some consultations. They inform them about the actions, make sure that they got the right information about the project, so their sense and understanding of the project improves and they're more willing to support it. Some elements that are needed for that to build stakeholder trust, and trust is a very important element of building relationships with the stakeholders, includes consistency and predictability of your actions, how you perform, accurate communications, that you have open and honest communications, and empathy, the ability for you to show concern for others. These are the elements important and characteristics to manage the trust in the stakeholders, and they are very important if you need key stakeholders who are going to be supporting the project. One of those techniques is stakeholder communications. It is said that a project manager will spend 80% of his or her time on communications. And that means a step of having a good strategy for communications, having a good understanding of the requirements of information from the stakeholders, using the right channels to communicate, having a calendar for those communications, and using some principles and values in how you communicate. Here's a simple communication plan where you can list your key stakeholders. You can have many on that list. You define their scope of interest, the level of detail that they need on the information, any specific formats, the frequency of the communication, who's going to be responsible for communicating with that stakeholder, and feedback mechanism. This is important because it helps us understand whether or not the communication was correct, whether it was in the frequency, the format, or the level of detail. But the feedback mechanism helps us make the corrections so that we can continue with that process and providing the right communications to these key stakeholders. Thank you.